I'm John Kemp from the Giant Hogweed Mitigation Project. We started this project in 2018 after a request for help from various different parties. We sent out about 100 solicitations of interest and subsequently embarked on doing this as a bigger aspect than just one or two people. So the idea is to coordinate the activities of various volunteer groups and government groups. We've been working with kayaking clubs and canoe clubs, the local officials with the weed inspectors, the county folks. We've been working with the province and the government as well. The next slide would be good. So this is predominantly focusing on, well, exclusively on the Grand River watershed. And Grand River is the play area basically for many people from London and Toronto and Hamilton. It's got fast water, it's got slow water, it's got lots of fishing, hunting, boating. It's a great place for recreation. And it's been introduced, or giant hogweed has been introduced to the river, and it's spreading as the seeds float down the stream. It's a great tourism feature. So we don't want to affect tourism in a negative way. We definitely want to try and get giant hogweeds out of the picture. Next slide. This is a picture of a boater who stopped along the side of the road. I think it's one back. We have a bit of a problem finding which one's which here. Should be one slide before that. There'd be a tall person standing beside a large plant. And it's the giant hogweed plant. It's in bloom. It was in July. And he got uncomfortably close to it, but he knew not to touch it. This slide is talking about a future to avoid. Joseph Caffrey is the most prolific writer or researcher on giant hogweeds. He was with the Irish Fisheries Ministry, and they were concerned about the invasion of the weeds on the river. And his quote was, "Since the 80s, the plant has seriously impacted on the beneficial use of the watercourse. Continuous dense stands of this tall and hazardous plant have established along the river corridor and over many kilometers of the channel, have precluded use of the river by hunters and fishers." So we want to avoid that. 2018, we had a few populations, 23 populations we found in total. They were scattered. Most of these show up in the central area, in the Cedar Brant County area, and that's predominantly because that's where we were looking. People started looking there, so that's where you find stuff. Should be one back, 2019 slide. We had 43 populations, so it essentially doubled in 1 year. And that's a scary thing. You're talking about invasions and exponential growth. Doubling in a year is a problem. And again, this is where people were predominantly looking. Above that, we didn't have many scouters, and below that isn't really the tourist area. Next slide. In 2020, we had quite a bit more. We had 53 populations, which isn't much in the central area. And then we had some more people joining the hunt in the northern portion, and they found 60 plants or populations just in the Kitchener area. That's the next slide, please. You can see on this one that there's a lot all in the Kitchener area. This we concluded is due to the 2017 June flood, moving seeds from some upstream area down here, and then in 2018 no one noticed, and 2019 they grew, and now 2020 we're finding that they're mature plants, and the large colonies have started. So this was reported to the city of Kitchener, and the Kitchener city responded. Now with COVID on, of course, that really complicates the issue. So they had issues getting people out in time to attack the weeds, but they did get out. They did do control. They took care of the high population density danger areas first. There were places where the weeds were hanging over the walkway, the paved walkways along the river. So they took care of all that. Some of the other areas that were further from the shore, they didn't quite get to. So we stepped in and gave them a bit of a hand there. We'll talk about that later. Yeah, next slide. The transportation, the seeds transport down the river because they float. So the research has indicated they can float between 1 hour and 72 hours. That's quite a wide spread. It has to do with the moisture content of the seed, how waterlogged they are, whether they dirt on them, which weights them down, or a bubble attached, or they're attached to ice and floating, or underneath the ice and they're buried. Once they sink, they rot. The speeds of the river can be 25 kilometers per hour during high water conditions. But if you take 25 kilometers per hour times an hour or two, that doesn't really tell you where the seeds end up. They end up landing in high water eddies. So not the eddies you find when you're kayaking in nice, calm, low water. We're talking about eddies that occur during water that's 5 to 10 feet higher than you'd be doing. So different objects are causing the disturbances in the eddies. The downstream end of an island might get giant hogweeds much more so than the upstream end. Behind a bridge or downstream from a bridge, there might be giant hogweeds, that kind of thing. Moist soils will grow the seeds where if they land on sand or rock, they won't grow. And if they land in an area where there's people monitoring, they'll likely take care of it. But if it's where no one's looking, then they'll get a chance to get a. They'll germinate the first year and they'll grow large amounts of foliage. And the second year they'll grow and produce lots of foliage. And if they had a good first and second year, they may go to sprout to flower in the second year. About 90% of the plants that have full sun do flower in their second year, but they can take up to 7 years to grow. So our approach to publicity, initially we're always focusing on the successes. There's only a few populations, 200 populations of weeds perhaps on 280 kilometers of river, and there's 2 shores. You're not likely to bump into any. So also there's been a few injuries so far. There's hardly any news about people being affected by giant hogweed burn in Ontario. You'll see some very exciting things on the internet, but typically that's the same reports from years ago and they're different countries. So it's not a problem at this time here. So we don't want to cause tourism concerns. We've identified the stakeholders. We're working with them. We don't want to send out exciting news adverts in the papers and stir up the trolls and cause all kinds of negative repercussions. That's not productive in any way. We're targeting the parties with vested interests. So we'll talk to the canoeists and folks like you that might be concerned or perhaps can help. We educated landowners. We'd handed pamphlets to every mailbox from Brantford upstream to Cambridge, and that was productive. Now we're working on a bigger picture. We've determined that most people don't know what giant hogweed is. They don't know what it looks like. They like it that way. They're happy. Everybody thinks it's the government's problem. So we got to work with that. Next slide. So each year we have to basically start planning again. We figure out where the seeds were last year, where the seeds are likely going to be this year, who's going to help, where are we going to go. So late winter we'll get commitments on what lands we're going to do and how we're going to exterminate or dig or what is the exact activity we're going to do. In April we'll go out and scout at the hot spots. We'll see how big the seed bank really is. How can we get there? Do we need a boat? Can we ford? Who's coming? And then in April we'll begin hunting in earnest, typically with a shovel. It's easy to walk with a shovel. It's like a walking stick, and it's got a secondary use. You can cut out giant hogweeds when you find them. So May, that's our last chance to handle large patches with herbicide. And then July and August, we're looking for majestic flower heads that stick up above everything else. You can see them from a boat. And then we'll have to get some people with hazmat suits to help us out. Here's a success story, Absalom's Island. This is 2020. This picture, the shaded area in the center, was the population in 2020 of weeds in the spring. There's 0.5 hectares of giant hogweed. It was seen by a canoeist in 2018. And the stinging nettles were like armpit deep, so they didn't go very far. So we confirmed from Google Earth that in fact there were 36 flowering plants. Then in 2019, there were several hundred flowered. We tried to get some of them cut out, but we had issues with land ownership and getting personnel to assist. In 2020, we contracted herbicide control with donated funds. And then at the end of 2020, only 4 plants flowered on that island. So we did a great job there. We discovered that this island does not have an owner. It's part of the native land dispute. Next slide. So this is the Google Earth picture. You can see a little dot up in the top. The narration is not big here. A little dot in the top is a red pin, and that shows where the canoeists landed. And then if you look down into the central area, you can see little clusters of white dots. So basically you're going to have a centered light green cluster dot and then 3 or 4 white dots around it. So this counts out to 36 giant hogweed seeds, and yes, or plants. You can see them from space. It's kind of a handy tool. Next slide. Another island. This one's in Cambridge. 0.6 hectares of giant hogweed. This one was easy to afford too, so we got out early with a shovel, took care of it. We took out 285 plants. This spot we also used for drone testing. We'll talk about that a bit more. I could walk on the island with my shovel, and the drone could fly around, and we could determine the young angelica plant from the giant hogweed leaves with the drone. So that was marvelous. And this is a success story because in 2020, no new seeds fell. 3 visits to the island with a shovel, and we took them all out. Next, please. Another island again. This is in Kitchener. Harder to see. There's a bit of a figure 8 shaped gray spot in the middle of that island. This is near Cold Park. It's 0.15 hectares. There were no flowers in 2018, so this is fairly new. We think this one probably came from the 2017 flood as well. It was too late in 2020 when this was found to do any kind of control, so this is just ready for next year. No ownership determination yet. We're presuming that it's another native land dispute. So early spring is when we want to get out there and start looking, hiking with permission from landowners. And if you look around there, you can see it in the background there, everything's gray or brown, except the green patch in front of them. Underneath the lady's foot, you can see there's some garlic mustard, little bitty leaves. This pair was walking along looking at all the garlic mustard, thinking this was a giant hogweed. And finally, when they found a giant hogweed, they said, whoa, these are giant. And then they could go a lot faster. So 5 kilometers is a good limit for hiking along the shore in a day because it's really tough walking. Next slide. So this is a drone. This is John from Airborne Recon. We contracted him to help us out. So he was flying, that's his favorite drone there, high-res drone at low altitude in order to get the resolution you need to determine one plant leaf from the other. Worked out quite well. It's a great application. Next slide. Late springs. This is May 20. The canoeists had spotted something peculiar from the shore or from the water, and we went and had a look. This is Megan. She's over 6 feet tall, so that gives you an idea. This cluster is over 3 feet tall, and that was all from one parent plant. And we dug those all out, and nothing came back. So that's a small success story. Next slide. Seed collection. This is our last resort to keep the seeds from spreading. This is near Kitchener. We saw this huge patch. We knew we couldn't deal with it, so we put out a plea for help, and we got this team come in from Guelph. We had master's students, master's graduates, lab technicians, and one of our sponsors came out, and we had some regular volunteers. And just to make a note, this was taken when there was no mask requirement yet for COVID, and we were staying as far apart as we could most of the time. This is pretty close to 2 meters spacing. 21 garbage bags of seeds we collected, which totaled 165 kilograms, about a third of the crop. Didn't get them all, but we made a big difference. Next slide. Education. That's going to be a key. Here we talk about the magnificent and the important are not the same. The glorious, magnificent plant, you want to stand and look at it when it's July before you cut it down. But in April is when we really want to deal with them. They're small, they're easy, no PPE required, no licensing, no herbicides, just you and a shovel. Everybody can get involved and we can deal with this. Next slide. Oh, back up one. So again, education, we've moving away from landowners and river users to the general public. We're going to get some paid adverts out shortly with the donated funds. We've got some cooperative advertising. We've been speaking with OMAF and with Ducks Unlimited, see if we can get something going with them. There'll be some stuff in the news media coming up in February, and we're sending flyers to schools and boards of education because, face it, our kids grew up with poison ivy, but now kids are going to have to grow up with poison ivy and giant hogweed. They got to know what it looks like, how to avoid it, and what to do when they find it. Next slide. So we're moving all of our present data to EdMaps. We've got 2 different platforms running right now from different sources, and it's a little cumbersome. Initially, we avoided EdMaps because it wasn't possible to remove a sighting, which meant the Grand River would look like a giant hogweed nest, and it would be unfriendly. Now that that limitation has been removed, it's our favorite platform, so we'll be moving everything in. That will help people like yourselves and other interested parties to see what's actually going on here instead of having to email us. Next slide. So we have a good pattern. We think it's working. We're going to do it again. So if you want to join us, it's a Giant Hogweed Mitigation Project. It's a Facebook group presently. Go for a hike in late April. Take a friend and a shovel. Go boating in May, and July 1st weekend is awesome because that's when the flowers are up. You can have a real good look at them. Check out the majesty of those huge plants. Take some pictures. Let us know where you find them. Check out the Facebook group for opportunities to get suited up and overheated in July. We can always use somebody who's brave enough to put on a suit and take out some more seeds. And by all means, write a couple letters. Write a letter to your MPP and write a letter to your local councillor. Let them know this invasion is going on and we can't just ignore it. We know from pandemic exponential growth that it can be an issue. It's the same thing. It's exponential growth. We need to catch it when it's little. Next slide. Okay, so this spring, 2021, anytime between mid-April and mid-May is your best chance to find them. The other vegetation is small, and these ones are easy to deal with. If you find something, send us a picture to gianthogweed@rogers.com, or you can post it in EdMaps. Either one works. And here's why I put in my shameless plug for Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, because if you join them, you can get some membership liability insurance, which might be handy, and hey, it's pretty cheap. Next slide. So the bigger picture, government participation. We've been working with various governments. The local governments are all on board. They're looking for ways they can help us. Provincial government, we've been working with 3 different ministries, trying to find ways that we can coerce them into getting involved. There seems to be some reluctance to extend themselves. The federal government has indicated that they are clearly not involved unless the Grand River suddenly becomes a border, then it's not their jurisdiction. Grand River Conservation Authority, their mandate is to work on projects that are requested by or affect the municipalities and the jurisdictions in the Grand River watershed. That yet hasn't happened. No one has requested that. You could help us by sending a letter to move that along. By sending a letter to your MP or your local councillor would help that as well. You got to protect the downstream neighbors. That's the big deal. It's not fun having seeds show up that you have to pay to get rid of the plants. And volunteers have been the key so far. All this work's been done with volunteers or donated money. Next slide. And I'm proud to say that our partners and sponsors, Basis Plant Council, they got us started back in 2013. Freedom House Church is our sponsoring charity. Grand River Rafting is a local outfitter who's very happy with what we're doing. And local landowners have been providing grant money. Next slide. And here's someone who's been helping us. There's some nice tall weeds that we were working on, and this would have been early August. And that's all I have. Time for questions. So I see a question here. Is the foliage poisonous in April or May? Yes, the foliage is poisonous at any time. If the plant is green, the sap is what gets you, actually, not contacting the plant. Mm-hmm. However, giant hogweed plants tend to ooze the sap out through the hairs on the stem, and it can be weeping on the leaves as well. Another question: do we have scouts along the Speed River and the Eramosa River up through Guelph and beyond? We have reporters in the Guelph Kayaking Club and the Waterloo Wellington Canoe and Kayak Club and the Ancient Mariners. We do have reports from the Speed and the Eramosa and the Irvine, but we don't have any confirmation of those yet. We're a little limited on manpower. We need either photographs or personal check to make sure that it really is there before we'll put a pin on the map and publicize it. I thought you mentioned PPE not necessary. In April, PPE could be necessary if you're going to pick the plant, but what we do in April is we just use a long-handled shovel and you wear regular clothes. So if you touch the plant with your shoes or your clothes or your shovel, that's not a problem unless you then rub it all over your hands. So you don't really need any PPE, you just need to use some common sense in April. What type of herbicides are used for control? We don't actually. I don't have a license. No one in our group has a license, so we contract that out. I believe the last reports I read about glyphosate is very effective, and I believe arsenal was used on the Absalom's Island. And that's about the extent of my expertise there. We just hire that service out.
Wow. Well, thank you, John, for a really interesting presentation. And I think you've raised the whole issue of public health, which is very timely, but it is something that I find we often raise, and people are surprised that there are plants out there that can seriously harm people. And as you said, the public isn't aware. So thank you for the great work that you do. Thank you for your passion. And I look forward to working with you as we go forward here. So thanks so much for presenting today.
Thank you.